شكرا دكتورة ياسمين. السادة الحضور، بنذكركم انكم ممكن تستخدموا سماعات الترجمة لتحقيق أقصى استفادة، ونأكد عليكم تركها على المقاعد بنهاية اليوم إن شاء الله. الآن سنستمر مع الدكتورة سوزانا مولينس من جامعة كيب تاون ومحاضرتها بعنوان ماذا في النسخة؟ المخطوطات الغربية الإفريقية كقطعة فنية. الدكتورة سوزانا هي مؤرخة بارزة وخبيرة في المخطوطات، تتخصص في المخطوطات الإسلامية الإفريقية وتمتلك خلفية في الدراسات الإفريقية والتاريخ الإسلامي، وتركز أبحاثها على الأهمية التاريخية والثقافية والدينية للمخطوطات في المجتمعات الإسلامية الإفريقية، خصوصاً في مناطق مثل غرب أفريقيا والساحل. فلتتفضل.
So thank you very much. I would like to thank the organizers, the School of Calligraphy and Ornamentation, for inviting me here today. Thank you very much, and for the organization, but especially for including African manuscripts, African Arabic manuscripts in this conversation, because very often these manuscripts are completely ignored. They're not in the conversations about Arabic calligraphy more widely in the Islamic world. So I really appreciate their vision to invite this, to represent this tradition to the conversation. So thank you very much. I want to just begin by giving you a little bit of a context of the region, because I realize probably you're not very familiar with the region that we're talking about today. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but just for you to understand that the region of West Africa that I'm speaking about are the countries that today encompass the current countries: Mauritania, Mali, Niger, northern Nigeria, Burkina Faso, Senegal. So it's this West African region. Of course, before the advent of colonialism, these weren't the countries that were there. But there is a long history. We have to understand there's a very long history of settlement and states in the region. Of course, one of the key aspects of this is the trans-Saharan trade. I'm sure all of you have heard about this. It was extremely famous. But of course, this is the moment where Islam starts spreading in the region from about the year 1000 AD. And it starts spreading from North Africa. But of course, the way Islam spreads is really through these commercial networks established by the trans-Saharan trade. It was really merchants and men of religion that spread Islam throughout the region. And of course, the first adopters of the religion in these areas were the rulers. So the rulers of the states, such as the state of Mali, the state of Songhai, were really the first adopters. And then there was a whole learned class and merchant class, and eventually Islam started spreading throughout the wider population. So it is very important for us to keep in mind this, this context when we speak about this manuscript culture. So, of course, what is the wider Islamic context? This is, of course, Sunni Islam, Maliki madhab, very important to understand the type of works of law that are in the region, and also tasawwuf is also important in the region. So what are some general features of West African manuscript culture? Of course, like in any other region of the Islamic world, the texts are religious texts, texts of the Islamic sciences, letters, commercial documents, legal documents. Of course, the manuscripts are written in Arabic. This is why they are Arabic manuscripts. But there is also a very strong aspect of multilingualism in the manuscripts, which we speak of Ajami manuscripts, which are African languages written in the Arabic script. Languages such as Hausa, Fulfulde, Wolof, which are written in Arabic characters. These were local languages that did not have their own scripts, so with the coming of Islam, they adopted the Arabic script to write the local languages. So in these manuscripts, we have layers of languages. The majority of the text is written most of the time in Arabic, but you have comments and glosses in local languages. Of course, the so-called Golden Age, what is very famous about this region, is the manuscripts of Timbuktu. Maybe some of you have heard of them before. They became quite prominent in the news. And the Golden Age, for you to have some sense of when the Golden Age of that culture was during the Songhai state, which was from the 1430s until the Moroccan conquest of the region in 1591. But in fact, the majority of the manuscripts that we have extant from the region are from much later periods. From the 18th century onwards, these are the majority of the manuscripts that we have, and we have huge numbers. I mean, no one really knows how many manuscripts are in the region, but it is over at least 500,000 manuscripts. I mean, we're talking about here huge numbers of manuscripts. So now I'm going to go to the actual topic of my paper. So I want to make an argument about the idea of copying. So copying is usually associated with a lack of originality in Western discourses that value the original as a site of creativity, uniqueness, and inventiveness. So a recurrent indictment against the Timbuktu manuscripts is the prevalence of copies in the archive. So usually it has been denigrated as a derivative archive containing only copies of works that were composed elsewhere or multiple copies of the same manuscript. So the Timbuktu manuscripts have been ignored, as I was saying, by so-called serious scholars of the Islamic sciences and Islamic manuscripts in history. Eventually, it was up to historians of Africa to begin to research these manuscripts, even though they were still relegated in mainstream scholarship on Arabic script manuscripts. And for a long time, this lack of in-depth study of the Timbuktu manuscripts relegated the archive as a status of a mere symbol of written culture, but little else. But I would like to argue that copying in the Timbuktu archive needs to be understood as a generative practice, a long preferred mode of knowledge preservation, transmission, production, and the creation of calligraphic art. So in what follows, I will illustrate these multiple practices of copying by scribes, students, and by scholars, and I will concentrate on four main modes of copying. Copying as a preservatory tactic, copying as a knowledge transmission mechanism, copying as a knowledge-producing practice, and copying as generative calligraphic art. So the various facets of copying are illuminated in a condensed form in the colophon of a manuscript, which of course you all would know is a note at the end of the manuscript that may give information about the title, the scribe, the place of production, the date of production, the sponsor, the cost of the manuscript, etc. In West African manuscripts, colophons are very common, although the scribes will not always make themselves known and often choose not to disclose their identity. Even though they might record other information such as the date of the copy or the commissioner. Copyists often denigrate themselves to demonstrate their humility with phrases such as sleeps often and prays little. This we find in many manuscripts. While most copyists who record their names are male, there are several examples of female copyists in the Timbuktu manuscript, such as this image that you have here of Khadija Al-Aufi, who copied a collection of poems in a flowing hand, decorating portion of the text in red ink. And one can assume the presence of female copyists among the many unnamed scribes of the Timbuktu manuscripts. Copying as a profession also seems to have been transmitted in families, such that of Alpha Bania, who traditionally serve as imams of the Jingari Bear Mosque in Timbuktu, which is one of the very important mosques of the town. And many of the manuscripts in the collection were copied by Alpha Bania's descendants. The professional scribes, of course, also charge a fee for their labor. and the fee is often recorded in the colophon. The currency exchange varied depending on the time and the region, of course, but it was probably in measurements of gold, which in the region is mithqal, silver, the real, or cowrie shells, which served as a medium of exchange across West Africa until the colonial period. Several scribes could work together on a large commission together, each one copying a few volumes out of the whole, as well as proofreaders who could check the copies and correct any mistakes. An outstanding example of this is this manuscript here, which is located on several colophons from a manuscript copied in Timbuktu in the 1570s, a 28-volume copy of the Mukamfil Lugha, a dictionary compiled by the 11th century Andalusian scholar Ibn Sina. 3 copyists shared the labor of copying and vocalizing volumes 17 to 22, and it seems it took a copyist 23 days to finalize 2 volumes of 177 folios. Each copying received a fee of 1 mithqal of gold, which is equivalent to 4.5 grams of gold, while the proofreader received half as much. A pair of volumes attracted the same fee, a large volume, as a smaller one, and it seems that maybe the amount was a monthly wage for the copyist. Thus, the colophon exemplifies the link between a particular copy of a manuscript, its physical maker, the author, and locates the copy in space and time. In the colophon, copying as a practice is individuated, but it is not the only place in the manuscript where the copyist is made visible. Copying was used actively as a preservatory tactic, as I mentioned. This mode of copying concerns the physical makeup of the manuscripts themselves, and the work of the copyists and scribes aimed to counter the natural elements, man-made disasters, or material loss. The Timbuktu manuscripts, and this is a feature that is very different from manuscripts from the rest of the Islamic world, are for the most part written on European paper. So this is not Islamic paper, this is European paper, which was imported to the region through the trans-Saharan trade. And the paper was produced specifically for the West African market, and due to the long distances the paper had to travel, it was a very expensive commodity and was used with care and reused multiple times. The nature of the imported paper, which was not necessarily of very high quality, combined with the climatic conditions of the Sahara and the Sahel regions, exacerbated the degradation and damage to the manuscripts, which became easily broken and brittle and decomposed with ease. And West African manuscripts, this is another very unique characteristic, are characterized by their loose leaf format. In other words, they are unbound, so not bound, and kept together with a leather cover and usually inserted in a pouch. The covers were made using stiffening materials ranging from leather and hide to stiffened cloth strips, as well as paperboard made from discarded paper, glued together to create a thick board. The manuscripts covers themselves also contain traces of the making and remaking of the manuscripts. The mastara, which was used to create blind ruled lines for the scribes to guide the hand, are often visible. We also see repair work done on the torn pages and evidence of former construction. These characteristics and formats of the manuscripts suggest a manuscript culture acutely aware of loss and destruction as a natural condition. As a counterpoint to the destructive aspects of loss outlined above, copying was used productively as a preservatory tactic, of course, where lost, damaged, or destroyed manuscripts could be replaced, replenished, or remade. A striking example is also illustrated by the manuscript I mentioned before of the Al-Muqam of Ibn Sina. In the colophon to volume 19, the copyist claims that the commissioner of the copy initially hired one Baba bin Abdurrahman and paid him for the job. But after the time, Baba claimed that his copy of the volume had burnt in a fire that set his hut ablaze. And thus, the owner of the manuscript hired him, Muhammad bin Andud, to complete the copy. And this we find in the colophon of the manuscript. Another salient feature of that colophon is the mention of the copying of the paper for the copy, which was provided by the commissioner to the copyist. So copyists often left small notes on the manuscript to test the kalam and the ink, as not all the paper was of the same quality. The scribes were acutely aware of the transitory nature of their own life compared to the text that they were copying. A common phrase left in the manuscripts after the completion of the copy is, "The copy remains long after its writer." And this is another phrase that we find often in the manuscripts. However, it is also common to encounter short texts, faida, written on the final pages of the manuscript that claim to protect the text from dangers such as floods, insects, or fire. Thus, the copyists and scribes demonstrated an acute awareness of the potential loss and destruction of manuscripts, and their profession represented a remedy to this aspect of loss. The format, so this unbound manuscripts, is intimately linked to their usage, which was in turn premised on their mobility, portability, and exchange. The unbound loose-leaf manuscripts were integral to the transmission and dissemination of knowledge. Sections of the manuscripts could be dispersed for teaching or ritual recitation purposes. They could be exchanged by scholars or distributed among students for copying. Thereafter, some manuscripts would be put together once again. However, perhaps a few folios would go missing in the process. Thus, copies would need to be made and inserted in their place. In this way, disparate folios could be reconstituted into a whole manuscript. And this unstable nature of the manuscript is evidenced by the many composite manuscripts in the Timbuktu archive. And by composite, I'm not speaking about the traditional definition of composite, which means one manuscript containing multiple texts, if they are bound, but in this sense, composite means one manuscript displaying a multitude of hands, script styles, and varieties of paper and decorations. Another consequence of the loose-leaf format is the many manuscript fragments present in the Timbuktu collections. The fragments could arise from several reasons. For example, when a manuscript owner would lend a portion of the text for a fellow scholar or student to copy, and then that was never returned, for example. Moreover, the manuscripts and copies were not only exchanged by scholars and students, but the ruling elites would also commission copies for their personal use. For example, a colophon in a copy of the Risala of Ibn Abi Zayd was commissioned by the 7th Askia of the Songhai, Muhammad bin Askia Daud, and so we have many examples like that. So West African manuscripts were part of a scholarly culture renowned for the centrality of their scholars, as opposed to fixed institutions such as madrasas or mosques. So the manuscripts traveled with their owners, who were often mobile, moving from town to town, and were easily dispersed, lost, or damaged. And even in Timbuktu, where certain scholarly lineages were established for a longer period, they still moved from one scholar's house to another, to the house of their students, or to copying centers. So in addition to being a preservatory tactic, copying was a dynamic, knowledge-producing practice and an essential facet of West African manuscript culture. The Quran was the foundational text, of course, that was first copied and recopied to teach basic reading and writing skills to children. This often took place on wooden tablets, lawh, that could be erased and reused as the child progressed to other sections of the Quran. Thereafter, the manuscripts were copied by their students as part of their educational journey. One had to master the great to advance to the next level of the curriculum, and copying and recopying demonstrated a mastery of the cornerstones of each subject. The manuscripts often contain many transmission notes, such as reading notes, that show where a student completed the lesson and with what teacher at what pace. And one example is this example, which is found at the bottom margin of Al-Mubin al-Mukhtasar, which reads, the note in the margin reads, I read this poem from my teacher who heard it from Ahmad Baba, who died in 1627 and was one of the great known scholars of Timbuktu. So there's a correlation between also manuscript layout and specific types of annotations. Layout and phases of education, which indicate that some of the annotated manuscripts originate from teacher to student interaction and some from personal use by advanced scholars. So once a student had graduated to the level of the scholar, one could begin to copy works by adding one's own commentary or a commentary on one of the great commentaries and definitions and explications in local languages, for example, or applications of these concepts into local contexts. And here we have some examples of a dictionary and some definitions of words in Songhai. And another example, which is very widespread in the region, is the commentary on poetry, which was preceded by the Harf Tafsirin, which you find in the first page, and then you have the poem itself. And in this case, the commentary of the poem often outstrips the actual poem in terms of the layout and the length. One of the scholars of Timbuktu, of the current scholars of Timbuktu, Sheikh Hamou, has composed a guide to the signs and the markings of the copyist. And this points to a writing culture that developed a shared practices and symbols that revealed skill and authority. And this tradition of transmission does not equal, what is important to understand, it does not equal mere repetition of past learning, but also includes an element of transition, whereby the achievements of scholars of the past are interpreted anew by the new generations. And finally, I want to look at copying as a generative calligraphic art, the artistic expression of copying. So this tradition is best illuminated by local copies of the Quran and other manuscripts. Unfortunately, the studies of West African script styles suffered from similar biases to those of West African manuscripts more generally. Usually, even today, the generic appellation of Maghribi or Sudani for these types of scripts is used to subsume several unique and distinctive regional styles. So the study of these scripts has been greatly advanced by a taxonomy developed by local West African scholars and then further developed by academics such as Mauro Nobili and Andrea Brigaglia. So these regional scripts, such as the Sahrawi, Suki, Barnawi, Kanawi, demonstrate an enormous variation. For example, the manuscript you have here in Sahrawi seldom presents perpendicular junctions between the vertical and the horizontal strokes, and the strokes are often very thick that it's almost impossible to distinguish the letters ba, ta, tha, and the medial nun, and ya, and so on and so forth. The manuscript on this side, the Suki, is written, very defined sets of lines, the ideal baseline, the perpendicular strokes, and some letters which are at more acute angles. So we find great variation. And then, of course, going back to this, we find in Central Sudanic scripts, such as this one here, the Barnawi and the Kanawi, the horizontal dimension is emphasized to the detriment of vertical one, and it's characterized by letters that are often squat and display short strokes beyond the baseline and are overall of the same height. So while the question of script styles has recently deserved notice, very little attention has been paid to an aesthetic analysis of West African calligraphic and ornamentation motifs, except for a few studies of Quranic boards, the Lawh, and the distinctive Quranic tradition of northern Nigeria. This is an area of research that deserves further study and on which I'm currently focusing through an analysis of a corpus of West African copies of the Moroccan scholar Al-Jazouli's, the Dalail al-Khairat. Why the Dalail al-Khairat? Well, few texts are more ubiquitous in manuscript collections and libraries throughout the Islamic world than this devotional text, and it has, of course, often been overlooked by scholars. It seems that the Dalail al-Khairat circulated in North Africa and West Africa before it became very popular in the Islamic East, and is a text that is often mentioned by West African scholars and is found in all West African collections. It is as popular in the past as it is in the present and exhibits similar characteristics to copies of the Quran, with frames, illuminated opening pages, discs between the prayer lines, and kept in ornamented boxes or satchels. And of course, there is the notable addition of the unique illustrations of the Rawdat al-Mubarakah and sometimes the holy cities of Makkah and Medina, for which the work is known. So I contend that the corpus of West African Dalail copies sheds light on regional and localized textual and visual sensibilities, as well as local processes of manuscript production. Thus, focusing on copies of this ignored devotional text highlights some of the originalities of West African manuscript culture. So I just want to show you now some of these calligraphic features for us to look at it in some detail. So in general, we find that they display similar patterns to the Maghribi Moroccan copies of the Dalail al-Khairat in terms of the division and some of the illustration. However, it is very clear that they reflect localized visual sensibilities in terms of the patterns, the motifs, and the scripts. And this raises a whole number of questions. So what was the relation between the copyists and the illuminators? Is it the same people? Did it run in families? Not only the copyists and the illuminators, but also the producers of the leather satchels. So we will see this in more example. I mean, this is a copy. One of the problems we have when studying these manuscripts is that we have very few dated manuscripts in the region. However, this one, which is found in the Danish collection, was copied before 1785. Why do we know that? Not because of the colophon, because it entered the collection of the particular collector from there, so then we know that it had to be produced before then. So we can really see the motifs in terms of the illuminations. The Medina double image is based on the Moroccan double image of the tombs and the mimbar, but a completely unique type of composition that you cannot find elsewhere. And if you look at the cover, just pay attention to the patterns on the leather cover and how similar they are, in fact, to the patterns of the illumination. So for us that have so little information, these are really clues into who could these people be? Did it run in families? Could they possibly be related? Some of the families had the leather workers, and others were the illuminators, and others the copyists. Those are all possibilities. Another dated, so I'm trying to show you some of the dated copies so that you can understand. This is produced in the 19th century. We can really see this idea of the illuminated so-called Maghribi Thuluth with a bubble-like contour that was quite popular in Moroccan copies in a certain period. And we find similar patterns. However, of course, the pigmentation, the colors, the inks are very unique to the region because, of course, they are produced according to local recipes. And here, in this case, we find the very classical, in a way, double image of Medina with the mimbar and the lamp, and of course of the tombs, which of course represent the tomb of the Prophet ﷺ, of Abu Bakr and Umar. But in addition, you find schematic representations of the mosques of Makkah and Medina, which this became very popular in the Islamic East. Of course, in Ottoman manuscripts, it becomes very popular. But in those regions, we see the use of perspective and so on. In this region, we see a very different type of stylization. And here you can really see in more detail the use of the script, the sort of vegetable motifs of the visions, the medallions, and so on in some more detail. But I also wanted to show you some other manuscripts of the Dala'il al-Khairat that are not necessarily very beautifully illuminated or very beautifully decorated. And this really poses questions about the uses of the manuscript. So sometimes the manuscript was used for certain uses, others for purely recitation purposes. So sometimes in one collection, you find a beautifully illuminated manuscript and a more simple one that served different purposes. However, this collection, which is the collection from Segu, which we also, because they are not dated, but because they entered the collection at the Bibliothèque Nationale before 1890, we know they date at least from that period. What is unique about this collection is that the Dala'il al-Khairat is usually divided either in halves or thirds or fourths in terms of their recitation, or sometimes in later periods it was divided in 8 parts, for a recitation for every day of the week and twice repeated on Monday. But in this manuscript, we find both divisions at the same time, which is quite unique. We have the division in quarters, but also if you see here, it says Yom HaThalatha, so it was the day of the week. So in the same manuscript, we find the multiple divisions, which is something quite unique. In the same collection, even though this is a very simple manuscript, it was still simply illustrated with a double Medina image. But at the same time, in the same collection, we find another manuscript that has a very unique illustration, which is, it's not very clear from the digitized copy, but it's the double Medina image in one. So not in 2 separate folios, which is usually the standard, but put together in one, in this image with the tombs on the top and the mimbar in the bottom. And then, in terms of the illumination and the ornamentation, we see a whole range of illumination and ornamentation, from strictly geometric-based designs to more based in architectural motifs, to carpet, to figurative, and even floral vegetative motifs. And as I mentioned before, these are replicated in the leather covers very often, and they're found in both illustrated and unillustrated manuscripts, so the ones with a Medina image and some that don't have any Medina image. So again, this poses questions in terms of the usage and the question of production. So I just want to show you a few more. For example, this one is quite interesting because it has a very unusual round border format. This is quite unique, this idea of a round border format. We find that very rarely in manuscripts, so that was something quite different. And this one was a beautifully, another copy that I found, which I found remarkable, the double image, but again, the replication of the patterns in the leather cover. So those are the little hints, because we have so little information, that help us as researchers try to find some clues in terms of who were these copies, who were the illuminators, who were the researchers. And I just wanted to show you, just almost to finish, I'm almost done, some of these this is a unique copy because the separation, the dividers contain unique headings in terms of the calligraphy. I mean, look at that. I mean, here we have the double image, the tombs and the mimbar, but then look at this image here, completely different. I still have to really get into the detail in terms of the interpretation, but look at these divisions, look at the calligraphic patterns. This is quite unique and not found elsewhere in terms of the manuscripts that we have. And finally, I wanted to end with these images. Also look at the colors. Of course, we have to be very cognizant of the question of paper. The question of paper is extremely important in our region. We know, as I explained before, it's all European-made paper. It was handmade paper before the 1850s. From about the 1850s, and this is why I explained it was so rare and so used with such care. But from the 1850s, we find the market is flooded with machine-made paper. And that is why there's such an explosion of manuscripts from about the 1850s onwards. But the quality of the machine-made paper is much worse. And then we see what happens with the ink, and so on. But this manuscript is also quite interesting because we see in this instance an empty space. So this really, we see that the writing came first, right? We have some of the illumination. So what happened here? Does the illustrator come after the calligrapher? Does in terms of what is the way these manuscripts were produced, this gives us a hint. So we can see here, this is fully finished in subsections, but here we're missing some of the illumination. So this really gives us some of the clues. So just to end, I just wanted to say that copying has to be seen as a generative, preservatory, and knowledge-producing mode, needs to be understood as constitutive of the Timbuktu archive. And integrating copying into the nature of the archive goes against the classic European understanding of archive codified in the 19th century, which persists in many quarters. And according to this notion, archival items are embalmed material, usually original documents produced at a particular point in time and offering archival testimony of the time. And they are often preserved then in the present, so goes the narrative, in their original form or as close as possible. However, the practices of copying that I have outlined for you illustrate a tradition of reproduction that is ultimately about transformation and change, demonstrating that records ultimately change through the act of reproducing them. Thus, copying in the Timbuktu archive underscores the making and shaping of manuscripts, sources, and archives, and shattering the illusion of permanence, immutability, and the meanings of originality in form and content of archives. Thank you very much. So, any questions from anyone?
We have about 8 minutes.
Okay.
Thank you for this presentation. It has been valuable information. I would like to ask, since you mentioned the effect of the trade with the Northern Africa, which affected actually the West Africa to be writing in the Arabic letters. But what about the effect of East Africa? Because as we know, there is a connection between especially the tribes coming from the East to West. And that area have been very active in terms of trade. So my question is, what is the effect of the East side to the West side in terms of the calligraphy and ornamentation? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So that's a wonderful question. So, I mean, the East Africa has a whole other tradition of manuscript culture. The East African coast, the Swahili coast in particular, from Ethiopia to Tanzania to Kenya and even down to Mozambique, that whole coast, has its own unique tradition of manuscript production. And those areas are more linked to Indian Ocean trades and networks. So we find the connections with Hadramaut, with Yemen, with Oman, and to the East African. So if you look at the manuscripts from this region, they're very different from the West African manuscripts. They are much more influenced by these East African trends, India and so on, you know, it's another world. But your point about the contact between East and West Africa is actually very important because we have evidence, for example, the Fulfulde are groups that settled from Senegal to Mali to Sudan. And so they also, this East and West flow throughout the Sahara, from Chad to Sudan, has been very little studied. And I have a colleague that's working on manuscript from Chad who's doing very interesting research, really understanding this other flow, understanding this East to West. But the problem with our region is that it's very understudied. So all of this is still to be researched, still to be explored. So, wonderful question.
Asking a question again, but thanks a lot. It was such an interesting presentation, and I know that you were focusing on the textual illuminated manuscripts, but because I've been studying Safavid, which is 14th century, Ottoman, which is 15th century, and Mughal, Indo-Persian, which is 16th century, kind of secular, figurative, illuminated manuscripts. So my question is, one, that we see the tradition of copying in all those, all those figurative manuscripts as well, and it's kind of an ideology of copying your master. And in that, you know, the artists will copy the same trees, the same figures again and again with new compositions. So I can see where this tradition of copying is coming from. But I wanted to ask, do you see any secular, figurative, illuminated manuscripts from the area? Or
Any, sorry?
figurative?
Figurative.
Yeah. Is there any tradition there? No.
So, no, I mean, this is very difficult to find. I've seen very limited figurative tradition. There's one manuscript copy of the Dalal al-Khairat from West Africa, but it is a early 20th century copy that has figurative elements. But I think what one can really see is a very symbolic type of illumination and patterns in here, which are more similar to Maghribi style ones than other figurative traditions coming further east. But it's still, I can't say I've looked at everything, and there's things we could find and explore that we haven't found yet. So hopefully more research will be done and will be better answer to your question.
Oh, we don't have time, I'm sorry.
Okay.
All right, we'll have time for one more question, please.
Okay. It says 4 minutes in my time here. I have 4 minutes and 52 seconds.
Hi, thank you very much. This is a short question. You mentioned the golden age. I was wondering, how was the status of the people who were writing or copying in comparison to when we talk about Ottoman, where it was magnificent and there was a lot of care from the ruling authorities. How was it in West Africa? Can you put us there at that time, specifically at the golden age you mentioned?
Okay. Thank you. That's also a good question. Well, our sources are limited to understand these types of questions, but from what we can see in like the colophon that I showed you in terms of the payment they received, that is a lot of money for the time in terms of gold, in terms of the payment they received. So from that, we can see that their status was quite high. As I mentioned, at that time, the majority of the population was not necessarily Islamized. So it was an elite group that was very close to the ruling elites and to the merchant elites. And in fact, there's been a lot of debates about why it made Timbuktu itself such an important and center at this golden age period. And in fact, it's because of this merchant network that was based in Timbuktu. They call it, the place where the canoe and the desert meet. So it was a center, but also the ruling elites left the control of the town to the religious scholars. And in a sense, this independence from the ruling elites and the power struggles of the greater empire allowed this culture to flourish. And the role of the copies, from what we can see from the historical chronicles, was quite prominent in terms of the respect in the society. But more details is difficult historically to give.
The very specific feature of sub-Saharan manuscripts, which is unbound in vouchers. And what is the most plausible explanation for that, considering that the tradition comes from an area where manuscripts are bound?
Yeah, so this is an interesting question. I have a colleague of mine, Dmitry Bondarev at the University of Hamburg, who recently wrote an article trying to find the origins. So he postulated that, in fact, in central Islamic lands, such as Uzbekistan and other areas, there were some unbound manuscripts, and maybe they reached the region. But I'm more interested in, that's why I emphasize the usage of the manuscripts. It became an integral part of the manuscript culture. One has to understand this is a place where paper was very scarce. If you're going to have a bound manuscript, you are limited in terms of what you can do with this manuscript. If you have a loose leaf manuscript that you can spread, you can give to everyone, many more people have access to this manuscript. So it became integral to the way the manuscripts were used. If one sees scholarly circles, even today in Timbuktu, you see a group of people sitting on the floor One manuscript is brought out. It is divided in many sections. Everyone takes a section. They can read, they can recite. You have an interpreter who interprets the scholar into the local languages. Then someone is making notes, and then you're finished with a session, and this manuscript is put together again. So these practices are still alive today, but one has to understand, I think, the nature of the unbound manuscript with its usage. So maybe where it originated, it's possible there was a practice elsewhere, but it became part of the integral nature of the manuscript culture because of this scarcity of paper. And that is my theory, I mean, at least, yeah. All right, well, thank you,
Okay.
thank you,
Thank
everyone.
you so much.